Welcome back to the Oscar Project Podcast, the show where I discuss Oscar-nominated films year by year. I am your host, Jonathan Eaterberg, and today I'm discussing the 1927 film Sunrise, A Song of Two Humans, with my friend Joe Cruz, who writes the Joe's Video Club newsletter. Joe, thank you so much for joining me to talk about Sunrise today.
Thank you for having me.
So before we jump into talking a bit about the film, tell listeners a little bit more about yourself.
Sure. So, the way I started coming to film criticism and critique and all of that is I kind of do it as a hobby. I've been watching movies since I was very little. I'm originally from Puerto Rico, and I grew up in a very kind of rural area that was sort of very isolated to an extent. So we had three channels, and one of them was PBS, right? So it was a couple channels, and the only gateway, right, to the outside world was going to the local video store. And I would rent a bunch of movies between the weekends or after school, and that was essentially the only thing that I would do, right? And even though I've worked in multiple industries in banking, finance, corporate communications, right now I work in academia, I've always sort of done something on the side, right, related to film. And right now I've been blogging. I have a newsletter that's been running for about a year now called, Joe's Video Club, like you said in the intro, and I run it on Substack. And it's the one thing that I have been doing consistently, where I try to watch at least 3 movies per, and then I provide very short summaries and my reaction. And I call it aggressively middle brow, because I try to keep it accessible, not too academic, not too dense. And I just I speak my mind, and I give my reviews of films. And so far, I'm looking forward to do it, for the long term. It's very exciting. It brought me back to watching films. I became a little bit kind of cynical, I guess, in the last 3 or 4 years, because streaming is taking away so much from filmmaking and movie watching. And writing this newsletter has kind of brought me back to thinking about film beyond just watching.
Awesome. Well, thank you once again for coming on the podcast. Before we get too far into things, I want to just go over the basics of the film we're talking about today. Sunrise officially released on November 4th, 1927, and had a New York City premiere earlier that fall on September 23rd, 1927. It was directed by F.W. Murnau from a screenplay by Carl Mayer and based on the short story Excursion to Tilsit by Herman Suderman.
The movie stars George O'Brien as the man and Janet Gaynor as the wife. And it runs for about 95 minutes. It was produced by William Fox and distributed by the Fox Film Corporation.
Sunrise did receive the second most nominations at the very first Academy Awards with 4, and it tied Seventh Heaven with 3 wins, including Best Unique and Artistic Picture, Best Actress, and Best Cinematography. The film is readily available on DVD and Blu-ray, and you can also find a recording on YouTube as of this date. So I guess we'll get right into the film. The first thing I wanted to mention, it opens with a title card, an inner title, that says, "This song of the man and his wife is of no place and every place. You might hear it anywhere at any time." And it goes on to say, wherever the sun rises and sets, in the city's turmoil or under the open sky on the farm, life is much the same, sometimes bitter, sometimes sweet. So right there kind of sums up the whole film in those first two titles that we get. It definitely is guiding you right into where what we're gonna see in the next hour and a half.
Right.
So we get a couple of scenes at the beginning. They say that it's summertime, people are out vacationing, some scenes of trains, boats, taking various travelers to their destination. And then we get another title card that says there's a woman vacationer kind of lingering in the city or the town where she's been visiting. And we get to see that woman. She is they never really name her. She's just the woman from the city. And she's kind of in her room, wherever she's staying, gets dressed and heads out for the night. And one of the first really awesome tracking shots of the film, right there at the beginning of her walking down the street, and we see her end up outside the home of the man that we talked about earlier. And obviously that there's something going on between these two right away.
Absolutely. And if one of the things, so I can't remember the last time I saw a silent film. I think it might have been something by Buster Keaton, probably The General, and that might have been like 6 or 8 months ago. And I had completely forgotten how some of the older films of the era incorporate tracking shots and just feel very modern, right? In the use of how the camera flows very seamlessly. And that start of Sunrise, like the first 10 minutes, I think it just feels very new, very modern, right? Despite the graininess, right? Despite the quality of the film itself, the way everything was constructed, feels like a film that was made a couple of years ago, right? And it kind of brings you in immediately. It's very immersive.
Yeah, it definitely makes you feel like you're right in there, kind of walking down the street alongside the woman as she goes down to see her lover. Of course, she stops outside his house. She kind of whistles, and they do. I read a little bit about that. They had some synchronized sound with the picture, so they did something with the music. Obviously, there's no actual dialogue there, but kind of the music indicates her whistle to the man inside. And here see him inside, kind of mulling over whether he should go out, and then we suddenly see why he's feeling conflicted in that he's got a wife who's getting dinner ready for him. So
Right.
immediately we have a conflict going on. So he kind of mills around a little bit, and eventually he does go outside and
Hmm.
ends up meeting up with this woman from the city, kind of off in the fields by the seaside, by the lakeside. And that was actually another shot that I read a little bit about, where they actually suspended the camera from on a platform as it moved through these kind of reeds and fields grasses up to where they finally meet. Thought that was an interesting thing. And you said about the tracking shots, obviously we're right before we get to the period of sound pictures where
Right.
they couldn't do that anymore. The cameras were so loud, they had to box them up and kind of put them back in one place like they were when film
Just
first started. So kind of reset everything. We think of sound as a good change to movies, but there was a lot of things that they couldn't do with that they were just learning how to do in those tracking shots and things like that.
That's right. Yeah, and one of the things I think about 8 or 9 minutes go on in the movie without a title card whatsoever. So this kind of speaks to the power of the film itself and how we it's very easy to follow this. We kind of know what's happening, right? With the camera suggesting kind of like the story along the way. I was very impressed by that. I knew of Sunrise. I had never seen it myself. This is my first time seeing it. It's kind of like an interesting exercise to watch something looking for these little nuggets right across the narrative. And yeah, the story, I mean, I it's not very complex or anything, but it's a very easy to follow just by with the visuals. But I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely, and I was going to say one of something very similar that, it's and actually I read that director Murnau kind of hated titles and he liked using the picture to tell the story a lot more. An interesting thing that I've seen in going through all of these films of the first Oscars, obviously they're all silent films with the exception of a little bit of sound in The Jazz Singer,
Hmm.
and seeing how differently they use the intertitles. There's a couple where there's intertitles every, 30 seconds to a minute or so. And then there's ones like this where it's very sparse. And actually at the end, kind of the second half of the film, there's hardly anything at all. It's all visual storytelling, which is awesome.
Yeah, I was kind of counting the dialogue because I found it was so sparse that I appreciated that. I mean, I think there was a thinking back then that if you didn't have enough title cards, that the audience would be lost, and I think that was a bit of a underestimation of the audience, right? Thinking of them as passive, not really. I don't think that should have been the case in any sense. Murnau he made The Last Laugh, I think, was one of the films that he made after Nosferatu, where he had zero title cards. It was just an entire sequence with no textual guidance, right? So, yeah, it's something that he fought against, but in the end, he had to sort of, do whatever the studio wanted to do.
Right. Yeah. And I'd like to say that, a lot of filmmakers today could probably take a lesson from that and tone down the dialogue in certain instances and let the visuals do more of the storytelling.
Absolutely, yeah. I think one of the when I said in the beginning that I was a little bit cynical. It's one of the things that I sort of observed recently in cinema. I don't know, maybe the last few years is this. It's where filmmakers sort of have this very interesting concept, this metaphor, even this allegory, and then the final act they feel the need to just hammer the point down multiple times and really explain things in a way that is digested. And I always think you don't have to. You had a great idea, you had a great symbolic visual narrative in the beginning. Let the audience think, let ambiguity kind of take over to some extent. You don't have to do that. You don't characters don't have to verbalize things, or you can show this with visuals, etc. And it's something that I wish we kind of harken back to the silent era where this is what they had to do because they didn't have dialogue. So it's kind of like the opposite of what I see now in film. I want complexity, I want nuance, I want ambiguity, and we're kind of getting a lot of literal interpretations that I kind of go, come on, you had a good 2/3 of the movie. You don't have to, digest things for me, but That's just me, cranky old cynical me.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. So while the husband is off with the woman from the city, we do get a couple of sequences with the wife back home with the child. And there's two other women in the home. I'm assuming them to be grandmothers or nannies of some sort, and they're kind of commenting on what's going on. The money lenders are coming to take stuff from the farm while the husband is off doing this thing. So then the woman from the city kind of asks the husband, come to the city with me, sell your farm. We can be together and live in the city. And initially, he's kind of violent towards her at that suggestion. Then kind of they quickly make up and they decide to come up with a story where the wife is going to have an accident, quote unquote, and drown in the lake, the river. And then the woman suggests using some bulrushes to help husband stay afloat after the boat capsizes, or after he sinks the boat, I suppose would be more accurate, so that he can survive and the wife can drown and be taken care of. So little violent. Just, we're only still about 15-20 minutes into the film and we're getting this very violent suggestion, but it would certainly accomplish their goals, I suppose.
It's a little bit jarring, actually, I would say. I wasn't expecting the violence, so there's a bit of like a flash forward, right? The character imagining what it would look like to murder his wife, and it's very graphic, right? It's something that I wasn't necessarily expecting in a movie of the era, but it stood out for me. The simple image, but I absolutely loved it.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's, I mentioned at the top, it's based on a story by the author was actually Lithuanian. I mean, what is now Lithuania, and it
Mhm.
was a collection of Lithuanian stories. So they're all
Yep,
kind of set in that area. It's that part is all taken straight from the story. We'll get to it a little towards the end, how the ending of the film is a little bit different from the story, but
that's right.
a lot
Yep.
of everything that leads up to this is directly taken from the story. So we very quickly get away from the two of them kind of making these plans. He gathers the bulrushes, hides them in the barn, then kind of lays in bed, you said, dreaming about what he's going to do, and tells the wife, okay, we're going to go on a trip across the water. And they very quickly, again, pack things up. He kind of says, hey, we're going on a trip. Just he packs right up and heads off, leaving the kid with the grandmothers and is ready to go. We have a little sequence with the dog, which I thought was interesting.
I love that sequence, by the way. It just felt kinda out of the movie into something it wasn't as symbolic, it was just a dog kinda sensing that something wrong was gonna happen, and it was a little bit suspenseful for me as well, but anyway, I love that sequence. It's a great sequence where the dog kinda jumps after them right
Yeah.
as they sail away, but
Yep. Yeah. Dog chases them, so the man has to kind of go back, put the dog back where he belongs, and then they head out in the boat.
oh, good. I think they sort of kinda stop in the middle, and then he stands up, he's approaching the wife, right, very slowly. I think they use slow motion in that sequence, and, he's about to strangle her, maybe push her overboard or, and he stops, right? He has second thoughts.
Yeah, yeah. So and obviously she's kind of pleading for her life. They end up getting to he settles back down and they get to some sort of landing where they can get off the boat. She, of course, heads off into the woods right away, and then he kind of gives chase, saying, "Hey, no, don't be afraid. I'm really not going to hurt you." They end up jumping on a trolley car that heads them into the city, and then they eventually end up, once they're in the city, at kind of a nearby restaurant. He gets her some food, and she's very suspicious initially, and finally gives in and is starting to come around and realize that maybe he's not gonna kill me after all, especially now that we're in this busy city.
Can I just interject and say that, and I guess we'll talk about the symbolic nature of the characters and the story and all of that, but she was very forgiving very quickly, given given what he was about to do, and I thought, obviously this movie is trying to be a little bit allegorical, I think, to some extent, and all of that. But I was thinking, I don't think that's I would have run away. It would I would have called the police. It would have been a
Yeah, went straight to the police department and told them what was
very
going
different
on.
reaction.
Yeah. And again, going back to the story, in the story, it's told from a very third person omniscient sort of perspective. And it continuously, even through the whole sequence where they're in the city and starting to kind of turn things around together, she's always thinking, okay, it's coming now. He's going to finally kill me, or he's going to finally do it now. And she's always got that apprehension that it's still going to come. Whereas in the movie here, you're right. They sit down, have a little bite to eat, and okay, everything's hunky dory.
He gets her flowers, I think. They get a
Yep.
picture. Everything's fine.
Yep. They go out and get flowers. They end up going by they end up kind of crashing a wedding in progress, and he kind of breaks down in the middle of the wedding. And there's a whole sequence that follows that where they want to have some wedding portraits taken, photographs. So husband is very kind of unkempt, so they take him to the barber shop, get him a clean shave. Woman asks him if he'd like a manicure, and initially he's going to say yes, but kind of sees that his wife is a little jealous across the room, so he's like, "No, don't worry about it."
He hasn't learned the lesson at all.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's a man who's kind of hitting on the wife, and he ends up, accosting that man. So there's a lot of kind of back and forth, and I think that a lot of that is visually building that relationship between the two of them back up, and I think it's pretty effective in doing that.
I think so, yeah.
So they end up getting to the photographer, and they have a beautiful picture taken. And while they're waiting for the photographer to develop the photograph, they accidentally they're messing around a little bit and kind of knock a statue onto the floor and take the photograph and head out as quickly as they can. Meanwhile, we get a quick shot around that time of the woman from the city who is still back in the country town and looking at newspaper ads about how farmers can sell their farms and move to the city. So it's clear that she still thinks the plan is in progress while these two are away in the city.
Mm-hmm.
And then obviously back in the city, they end up at some sort of carnival or amusement park type area. They get to play some games. I really like the one game they play where they're trying to get pigs to go down little slides. I didn't quite
Right.
understand the game, but it was a fun sequence to watch. And that, of course, leads to the husband having to chase the pig through the dance hall, which was a nice comedy routine, I think.
It was a good sequence. I also didn't get the point of the game either. But overall, one of my favorite sort of set pieces of the entire film is a very busy, very complex, very rich sequence with people and, like fairgrounds and all of that. It's a very interesting to look at from a visual standpoint.
Yeah, there's a lot going on in those scenes, and I think it juxtaposes nicely with the limited amount of stuff going on in the town scenes. Those scenes are very simple, very straightforward. There's not a lot of movement, whereas these scenes, that the whole city part in general, but those carnival scenes in particular are very busy.
That's right. Yeah.
I also wanted to say the ASPCA would probably have something to say about the treatment of the pig in this sequence. They end up pig ends up drinking some wine that's dropped on the floor and kind of starts to pass out. So they would have had issues with that, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So they end up eventually sitting down for kind of another bite to eat after some dancing, and then they go outside, watch some fireworks, and then eventually they take the trolley back to, I guess, where they left the boat, and the husband kind of says, "Hey, we're going to sail home, have kind of an extra little honeymoon now that we've made up and everything is happy." And on their way home, they end up running into a storm, and of course, the storm leads to the boat capsizing for real, unintentionally this time. And this time, instead of using the bulrushes for himself, the husband, lets the wife take them, and he somehow manages to still survive, ends up on shore, but she's missing. He ends up calling to a lot of the folks in the town who come out, get in the boats and help search for her. And just when he's pretty much, given up all hope, they do end up managing to find the wife, kind of pull her from the water and bring her back up to the house where, of course, everybody thinks initially she's probably dead, but at the very end, we see the husband and wife finally back together again, and they are assuming to be happily ever after. We don't know, but that's kind of the indication that that's going to happen. And we see the woman from the city has finally realized that she's not going to get the man after all. She heads back to where she came from, and the husband and wife are together as sunrise dawns over the town, which I guess is where we get the title of the film.
That's right. In Latin, I believe, finis, I think.
Yes, yeah, we get that.
Very close to, I think that's how the story kind of ends as well with finis.
Yes, yep, you're right. So kind of a lot there in the last little bit, but like I said, kind of the main part of that story is that whole city sequence, and then I felt that the ending was kind of a little bit rushed, and I feel like if somebody made this film today, that whole ending sequence would be another 10 to 15 minutes longer at least. There'd be a lot more suspense of the wife's ultimate condition,
Right.
if somebody was making that today.
I think so, and I mean, and we can get into, I guess, the symbolic aspects of the film if you want. I was gonna say that, first of all, it's the movie doesn't the movie's a parable, right? In the sense that, the characters don't have names. They're either the wife or the man or the woman from the city or the women or the barber, right? There's no names there. And I think the reason why I didn't feel like the ending was necessarily rushed in the sense that the woman from the city, she doesn't have a personality, right? She's kind of like she's an entity, right? To some extent. I was trying to find information and see if the director was religious in any sense, and I never found anything. Most accounts kind of said that he was just non-religious at all. But the movie, to me, it sort of dabbles in religious and spiritual themes while not necessarily feeling Christian or religious in the traditional sense. And the woman is just kind of like a stand-in for lust and corruption, right? And chaos and greed. And I guess that's why it was kind of rushed in the sense that she leaves, right? She's kind of like I mean, not kind of, but to me, she felt like a visiting spirit, right? It kind of goes around, kind of tempting weak men, right? And she couldn't get what she wanted, so she leaves and goes to the next town or whatever she's headed now. And that's just me.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense, and I forgot to mention it. There is one short sequence where the man kind of confronts her, and again is kind of very violent toward her, and it appears he
Right.
might be trying to kill her in his anger, and that's right before they find the wife and say, "Hey, wait, don't don't do something you're going to regret because your wife is actually okay back here."
That's right, I forgot about that. There's also there's a scene there that I love as well where the woman from the city is sort of hanging from a tree branch, and she's kinda looking towards the shore, and they're bringing back I think it's just the man who's kinda, like, in shock, right, after the storm. It's just a beautiful kinda composition there with there's multiple things happening at the same time, and the woman from the city is kinda witnessing from afar as they come back into the town, right?
Yeah. And it's interesting thinking about the tracking shot that we talked about at the very beginning, where we're kind of walking alongside her. Now
Yeah,
we're almost kind of in the trees with her, seeing her,
yeah,
seeing things from her vantage point in that particular scene.
that's right, yeah.
Glad you brought that back up. In terms of the actors we talked about, you mentioned him at the top. Obviously, I've talked a bit about Janet Gaynor on the podcast before when I talked about the film Street Angel.
Mhm.
We'll talk about her again in next week's episode for The Seventh Heaven. She was nominated for these three films, and I was trying to kind of rank my feelings on the three. I think I like her performance in Street Angel the best out of the three. And you're saying a moment ago about the woman from the city is kind of a stand-in, an entity, like, as if you will. I almost feel like the wife is similar, but
Mm,
the good side. They're almost like the angel and devil on the man's
that's right.
shoulders. And
Yeah, the wife dresses in white, the woman from the city dresses in black. It's very very archetypical, right? It's a very, very obvious.
yeah. So anything you want to touch on Gaynor specifically, since I've had my say on her in a number of these episodes.
Yeah, I mean, I maybe not just on her, but I think in with the acting in general, the silent era, when I think about it, it's two things that come to mind, right? It's there's a staginess to it all, to most films, right? And then there's the what I would call overacting that's kind of reminiscent of theater, right? And where there's emoting toward the camera. There's heavy eyeliner, especially in German expressionism, right? But in this case, I found the movie to be a little bit more subtle, a little bit more toned down in that there are some close-ups, but they're not overwhelming. And I don't think I have anything negative necessarily to say about the acting. Is it monodimensional? I think it's kind of meant to be in the sense that the characters don't have right they don't necessarily have personalities in the conventional sense. But I like Gaynor. I thought she had there's two scenes where there's a close up where she's either crying or just kind of feeling this is it for my marriage. It's over. I know it's over, but I can't really face it or accept it. and she communicates that very, very easily with her facial expressions. Not in the exaggerated sense that I tend we tend to associate with the silent era, if that makes sense.
I agree, and I think out of the 3 performances of hers that I've seen, I think that's consistent across the board. Obviously, a number of these films that I've watched for this project is fall into that category where there's a lot of overacting, a lot of over emoting. But I agree. I didn't see that as much in this one. That I will say in terms of the man, George O'Brien, I thought his transition was, his range in the film, if you will, was the best. One of the better ones that I've seen out of all these films. He has that scene where he's approaching her on the boat, and he's very, very menacing.
Mhm.
But then once he's clean shaven and in the city and dancing, it's a completely different character.
I was gonna say that with O'Brien, yes, if I were to kind of to highlight the one performance that I think is sort of the layered one, the one that kind of transcends the archetypical lines of the character is O'Brien's, right? He's a tormented, conflicted man, and you can see that in every part of his acting. And he has a transformation right in the beginning. He looks tired, and when he's contemplating killing his wife, he seems very depressed. And then he goes to the barber shop, right? He change there's light, and he looks clean shaven and all of that. Yeah, his performance, I'm surprised that he wasn't recognized the way Gaynor was,
Yeah,
because I think he's the one who goes through a journey, I think,
yeah,
more than the other characters.
definitely. And I think if this was a film like this was being recognized today, I think it would definitely have a better chance of him getting an award, a nomination at least for best actor
Yeah,
or something like that.
I would think so, yeah.
Couple of just kind of tidbits I had about him. He was actually the son of, George O'Brien, I should say, was the son of the San Francisco chief of police, who was actually the one who ordered the arrest of Fatty Arbuckle after his infamous Labor Day party, where one of the women who attended his party ended up dying.
Small town.
Yeah. O'Brien served in both World War I and World War II in the Navy, and was a light heavyweight boxing champion of the Pacific Fleet soon after World War One.
Wow.
The other bit I wanted to mention, and I might be the only one who saw this, but in certain scenes, I thought over and over again, it kept occurring to me that he looked like Christian Bale for some reason. I don't know if it was just the facial structure or what, but I kept looking at him like if somebody was remaking this and wanted to have someone look the same way, but they could use Christian Bale.
I looked him up as well. I don't he didn't remind me of any contemporary actor, but he was very young when he did the film. I think he was in his 20s, if I'm not mistaken, maybe 26, I wanna say. But he he's very accomplished. He wasn't just a handsome face or anything. He knew his craft.
Yeah, and he, went on to do a lot of, I think he did a lot of Westerns later in his career.
Oh, yeah,
So,
makes sense.
yeah, and continued acting well into the 40s and then early 50s as well. So he
Yeah.
stuck around for a while. The other one, we didn't mention her at the top, but Margaret Livingston was the woman from The City. Didn't find too much about her. Obviously, this is probably the best known role that the role that she's best known for. Probably will not be bringing her up in any future Oscar nominated film conversation. So just wanted to make sure that we mentioned her. Obviously, the big one, the biggest name probably other than Gaynor at this point was Murnau himself. Best known, obviously, for his Dracula adaptation Nosferatu back in 1922, which is obviously just recently remade by Robert Eggers early at the end of 2024. And this was actually one of his final films. He only made, I think, 3 other films after this because he was killed in a car accident in 1931, on my birthday in 1931, coincidentally. Obviously, it wasn't my birthday yet because I wasn't around, but
That's interesting.
and I also saw that, so he only directed 22 films in his career, and almost half of them are considered lost. So it's a shame that
Very unfortunate. Yeah.
we've lost so much of his work. I'd love to do a whole, 22 films is not a whole lot, so you could easily kind of do one a week and be done in a couple months, but unfortunately most of them are no longer in existence.
Yeah.
I also mentioned, as we're going through the plot summary, the short story Excursion to Tilsit, again by Herman Suderman, I think is how you pronounce that. He was born in what's now Lithuania, so all these stories in this collection are all kind of based in that region, but much earlier. They're based in the 1800s, mid 1800s, where The film is obviously moved to, again, an unnamed city and town, but it's, there's cars, there's lights, so it's obviously a much more modern version of the story, which I thought was an interesting choice.
Absolutely, yeah, no, I'm a fan. So, no, like I said, because I grew up in a rural area, I've always been fascinated by the city-urban divide and that clash of values. It's something that I think it's universal, I would argue. Something you find here in the US, something you find, elsewhere in the Caribbean or South America or whatever it is. And that's sort of like the theme that kind of emerges for me that I didn't quite see as prominently displayed in the story necessarily, but I think the movie kind of took it into a different level. And it's something that kind of called to me, right? I'm always fascinated by that, just that association of the rural with the virtuous and the city with chaos and the corrupt and all that. But
Yeah, and I thought, mentioned it earlier when I brought up the story at one point, but the story does have a much different ending. Obviously, the general structure is the same. They end up capsizing in the storm at the end, but the wife is the only one who survives in the story. The husband actually dies, and I thought it was an interesting choice to change that for the film. I think I understand why you'd want to do that, because the movie audiences want a happy ending. They want the full redemption arc. I think it would have, film wise, it would have been a little bit more unsatisfying ending to have him, die at the end.
I kind of would prefer the story to stick with the story ending only because again, I'm just my eclectic kind of taste in things. I like darker endings. I like the things with a little bit of an edge. You say, do you prefer the current ending, or would you
I
prefer the
I would
story
have
ending?
I would have preferred the ending from the story. So
Oh yeah, yes, yeah.
I'm thinking the thing that comes to mind fairly recently is Parasite.
Oh yes, yeah.
It's a very, there's a little bit of a glimmer of hope, but
Hmm.
generally speaking, it's a pretty dark ending,
Yes,
and half of the cast does not have does not even live to the end.
right.
Spoiling a 5, 6 year old movie at this point, but
Spoiler alert. There's a movie that I saw this year as well that I don't know if you saw it. It's a low budget horror movie from Spain called The Coffee Table.
no, I'm not familiar with that one.
It's just a cynical kind of psychological horror. I'm not gonna spoil it or anything, but it's that sort of uncompromising story where they're not interested in a happy ending at all. You can sense that from the beginning. It's not a spoiler really. But I thought the story was a little bit just edgier and it's far more interesting because I can see the case being made for the man finding redemption, right? And happiness after atoning for his sins and proving to his wife that, he can now he's better, he's a better man, right? He's content with the marriage or whatever it is. But that would have been a far riskier move if they would have stuck with the ending from the story, just giving the wife, I don't know, control over the farm or something, right? Rewarding her for being the pure soul from the beginning, if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah, no, I would have liked to have seen more of that as well. But I understand for
Yeah.
audiences of the time why they made that change.
Yeah.
Any other kind of trivia tidbits about any of the folks involved, the story, anything like that?
No, I mean, this is not necessarily trivia. If you kind of find information about the director, he was an intellectual man to some extent. He studied philology, which is, kind of like combination of a historian and a linguist, right? So if you're interested in the origin and evolution of words, right, which I don't think very few people probably study anymore in that classical sense, he was invested in sort of symbolic interpretation of words and the power of language and all of that, and that's something you can see in his films. You can see that in Nosferatu. You can see it here. He's really immersed in crafting symbolic images and with the power of metaphor and all of that. And he was a thinker. I think beyond being just a filmmaker, he's someone whom I think seemed to be well versed. I think in classical studies and all that.
Yeah, and it's interesting that we are recording this on the day after David Lynch passed away, and I almost
Right.
think that
Yeah.
they're kindred spirits in a way.
Yes.
Just kind of the way they approach film as an art form in general. There's nothing that can't be done if you set your mind to it, I think.
Good point. Yeah.
So I found several reviews of the time from around the time period. I don't know if you were able to find anything that from the time period. Generally speaking, the reviewers of the time liked the picture, although there was a couple that I saw. Time Magazine called the story meager.
I was gonna say they're not wrong.
Yeah, no, it's not wrong. Photoplay magazine. It says the sort of picture that fools highbrows into hollering art has swell trick photography and fancy effects, but boiled down, no story interest and only stilted, mannered acting. Not sure I agree on the acting, but I definitely agree that like you said at the beginning, that there's not a whole lot of story. It's pretty simple when it comes down to it.
It is, and yeah, absolutely. And I would call myself a story guy, but here I didn't mind that it was a very
No,
thin plot. I really don't care for that now.
yeah, no. I mean, there was enough to look at. There was enough. I don't agree that the acting was stilted. I thought it was. I thought the acting was excellent, like we talked about
Yes,
earlier.
yeah, I would agree. Yeah.
The other one is from Variety magazine. It says Sunrise is a distinguished contribution to the screen, but produced after the best manner of the German school. In its artistry, dramatic power, and graphic suggestion, it goes a long way toward realizing the promise of this foreign director in his former works, notably Faust, which was his last German film, and it was the one previous to this one. So generally favorable reviews, although I did also see that it wasn't very commercially successful.
I saw that.
We see that today. A lot of the best reviewed films don't do a whole lot at the box office. Obviously nowadays they're made with the intention of getting awards recognition.
Right.
But back then, obviously that was he was just doing it to make the art.
That's also the case with Nosferatu as well.
Yeah.
It wasn't a film that made a lot of money, and it became a cult classic later. But maybe it's part of that's how things worked, right?
And obviously a lot of we've talked about it already. A lot of the kind of more modern day critique and criticism of it. They talk a lot about the camera movement and how well that was done, how innovative it was for the time. We talked earlier about the lack of the titles. Generally speaking, obviously we get most of them at the beginning, and then it just kind of relies on the visual aspects throughout the rest of the film. And then the last one I wanted to quote. So this writer Pamela Hutchinson had an article in The Guardian back in 2011. She said it's one of the silent era's final hurrahs, and you couldn't watch this film and wish it were made in color with talking bits. It's perfect as it is, a monochrome fairy tale. Which I think perfectly sums that up.
Great way to put it. Yeah.
Anything else that you found in your research want to bring up?
Beyond that, I just a quick couple things. So they, if you look back at the scenes when the man and the wife go to the city, and they're kind of forgiving each other, and there's a few scenes where they're sort of in the forefront of the frame, right? In the back, there's a lot of action happening, and to create a forced perspective, the director hired children to dress as adults. So if you see people who look small and short in the back, it's because they're kids, right? He's kind of look to make the protagonist look, big and imposing, and sort of there's something happening in the back, but it's a forced perspective, therefore they look way smaller than they actually are. And the buildings are also smaller as well. It's a studio, by the way, which I was very impressed by. I thought the city shots were actually in a real city, and then the countryside was a studio, but most of it was actually a studio.
Yeah, no, I saw some of that as well. I hadn't seen the bit about the children portraying the adults, but I like that. And I noted too how several times they used that effect, and I was trying to tell in certain instances whether they were using some sort of forced perspective or if they were actually kind of doing a rear projection of kind of the cityscape behind them, and then almost like we would do with a green screen today. But obviously they didn't have that technology.
No, apparently it was all forced perspective, and virtually, including the fair, including every shot in the city. I think my favorite is actually the sequence, not my favorite scene, but I guess my favorite, scene in the city is when they make up and kiss in the middle of traffic, and traffic sort of halts, and there's this fast editing where there's people kind of jumping off of, I think it's motorcycles, and people just kind of, there's multiple crashes happening while they kiss in the middle of the street. Again, just very impressive stuff that I don't think you would find in a lot of movies of the era. And just, kind of incorporating that depth of field, right, and making everything look very busy. And I don't know, it's just fantastic sequence overall.
Yeah, no, I agree. I made note of that whole scene and how it is well put together, and you don't see a whole lot of stuff like that in other films. Obviously, at the Oscars, the first Oscars, I mentioned at the top, it was nominated for 4 different awards. It was nominated for Best Art Direction, which ultimately went to William Cameron Menzies for his film Tempest, which I discussed on an earlier episode, as well as The Dove, which unfortunately is another lost film. won for Best Unique and Artistic Picture. The only year that that award would be given out was the following year. It would be rolled into what we now call Best Picture.
Mhm.
Obviously, we've already talked about Gaynor, Best Actress for this film and two others. And then Best Cinematography, the individuals named were Charles Rocher and Carl Strauss. And it beat out three different films that were all shot by George Barnes, which was interesting that he had three options in there, and yet he still didn't win. Those films were The Devil Dancer, The Magic Flame, and Sadie Thompson. Obviously, so The Devil Dancer and The Magic Flame are both lost films, I believe. So I have seen Sadie Thompson, and cinematography-wise, I think this one far outpaces that one for sure. So I think definitely the best option out of those.
This is a movie that's usually cited by cinematographers nowadays when they need to study and look back and get inspiration, right, from the era.
And, obviously the three wins were tied for the most at that first Academy Awards with Seventh Heaven, which will be the next film up that we talk about. And those two remain tied for the most wins at a single Academy Awards until the seventh award ceremony, when it happened one night, took home all of the top five: Best Actor, Best Actress, Best Screenplay, Best Director, and Best Picture, obviously. So if you don't have anything else, we can probably get to our final thoughts and give out some ratings.
Sure, let's do that.
Well, I'll go first. I gave this an 8 out of 10.
Mhm.
Again, we've talked about a lot of the things that we really liked about it. All of the visual aspects of it. Despite what the reviews said, I thought the acting was really, really well across the board. So yeah, I very much enjoyed the film. I didn't expect to enjoy it as much as I did, especially after reading the story that it was based on. But definitely enjoy it, and I think it's one that I'll be returning to again, and might even bump up that 8 to a little bit higher at some point.
For me, I'm a little bit more sanguine. I'll say I'll club probably at 10. To me, this is one of the best movies I ever made, in the sense of kind of like the influence. If you look at it now, right, 100 years later, you can sort of trace that influence and look at similar shots and the use of contrast and the use of universal themes as well. When I was watching the movie, I was even thinking of The Godfather, in terms of how contrast is used, right? If you're thinking about the baptism scene, right, there's a baptism, which is supposed to be, good and virtuous, etc., versus kind of the killing of the families and all of that. And I'm not saying there's a direct connection there necessarily. I'm just kind of looking at how the values and vices are contrasted, right, with two different scenes or sequences happening simultaneously, right? So I think there's a lot there that just feels very modern, that filmmakers from the 70s and 80s probably picked up, right, and brought into their modern styles. It's not a movie that I think I'll be rewatching at any point, but it's a movie that sticks with me, right? And I'll be thinking about it. For me, that's a lot. So that's why I kind of give it. To me, it's an important movie. So I give it a 10 in that sense. I was very impressed. That's what I mean to say by that.
Awesome. High praise.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I will be sure to include a list of resources and links to any of the articles and reviews that we mentioned throughout the episode, as well as a link to where you can watch Sunrise online. Joe, thanks again so much for coming on the show to talk about Sunrise. And if you can just remind people where you can be found online.
Yes, so my publication is Joe's Video Club. You can find it on Substack. It's a free publication, by the way. All you need is an email account, and you'll be receiving my weekly reviews. If you do that, I would appreciate you following me. And thank you so much for having me, Jonathan.
Absolutely. And don't forget to follow The Oscar Project at theoscarproject.substack.com. And be sure to come back for next week's movie conversation, when I will be discussing the 1927 film Seventh Heaven. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you at the movies.